ICE detention centers, again at the center of controversy, as worries grow about the expansion of these facilities and the reality of the conditions behind bars. And fears are growing for the people held inside of them, many of them alleging they'd been detained without due process. By now, you might recognize this one controversial site called Delaney Hall. It's a new ICE facility in Newark, New Jersey. Local leaders allege that this site opened in defiance of state and local laws, and that the feds haven't been transparent about what's happening inside. Lawmakers say they've been trying to visit for days, but ICE and Homeland Security have repeatedly shut them out. In this video, you'll see Newark Mayor Ras Bakara, along with several lawmakers, protesting the site, asking for access inside. The scene gets incredibly chaotic and tense. On Friday, Bakara was ultimately arrested by officials and charged in federal court with one count of trespassing. He was released a few hours later, but he's still facing those charges. And DHS actually warns other politicians may soon get hit with the same. Here's what Bakara had to say on Politics Nation moments ago.
We don't know what's going on in there. We don't know who's in there. They don't allow inspections. They're not doing, they're not complying with the local laws. They don't have a certificate of occupancy in our argument. And we were in court arguing these matters. They feel like they don't have to go to court. They have a contention. We have a contention. They have an opinion. We do. We usually solve those problems in America through the court of law. They don't want to use the court. They want to use a decree. They believe that what they say goes, that we have a kingdom here and not a democracy. And that's the problem.
And joining us now, Paola Ramos, MSNBC contributor and the author of Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America, and Danny Cevallos, MSNBC legal analyst and criminal defense attorney. Okay, Danny, I'm going to start with you. Have you ever seen anything like these scenes?
No, that is a trick question. Of course not. I mean, no one's ever seen anything like this. I mean, no one's ever seen this kind of civil disobedience. But by the way, civil disobedience, and I would characterize this as exactly that, because you have leaders who are being arrested, almost on purpose to make a statement. That has a very rich history in the United States. And there's plenty of academia on the subject. So I would say, yes, we have seen things like this before. History doesn't always exactly repeat, but it certainly echoes.
Let me play for you what Alina Habba said. She's right now the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. Yeah, interim U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. So this falls within her jurisdiction. She was on Fox News. Let me play for you what she said. Get your thoughts onto it.
If you break the law, it will be enforced no matter who you are. You cannot be a politician and break the laws. You can't be a normal citizen and break the laws, most certainly not in New Jersey or anywhere in this country.
A bit ironic considering who the current president is, a convicted felon, and they're talking about, law and order and not losing sight of who the president is.
Yeah, but she's right. Even the arrestees had to know it was probably their plan to get arrested. And after all, getting arrested got the word out. We're talking about it. So this, again, is something that was probably calculated. I'd be really curious to see if the government actually follows through and charges. Yes, I mean, it would be some version of trespass on federal property, but possibly, if any federal officer was touched, you always have the potential of assault. So we'll see what they end up doing. But I'm really interested, not so much in Alina Habba saying that if you break the law, you'll be arrested. That's just some general phrase. But the real question is, will they follow through and actually prosecute?
My advice to Ras Bakara is to just declare himself a January 6th defendant, and he'll get the full support of the Trump administration, be treated as a hero.
But in all seriousness, Paola, remind us, though, what this protest is actually about and why so many people are concerned about what's happening inside detention facilities in the U.S. right now.
I mean, look, we know that inside, before even Donald Trump, there are human rights abuses that are committed inside of these buildings. But I think, to me, what's astonishing is that if you describe the scene that we are just seeing on our screens to anyone that has ever lived through an authoritarian regime, and you describe what we're seeing, which is literally masked armed men detaining and arresting someone because they are peacefully protesting, anyone, I think, would tell you that we're living under some form of a police state, right? And I think, to me, this is part of a larger pattern that we're seeing across the country, right? These, arbitrary arrests, these ICE, which you've seen, these ICE cars outside of college campuses, people being racially profiled in traffic stoplights. Just 2 days ago, you see ICE literally arresting a mother in front of her teenage daughter. What does ICE say? They say, we don't need to show you any papers. And so I think that type of recklessness, now that to me is what's scary. I do not ever underestimate the power of protests in this country, but I do feel that we're starting to feel a fear and a paranoia that to me is indicative of that police state.
Do you think these scenes, these images, they're actually meant to be seen and sort of send a message to the communities, not just, around this site in New Jersey, but around the country right now?
I think so, right? I think it's staged, but I do think that this is where Trump underestimates his cruelty, right? I think the understanding was that Trump's cruelty would work, that it would keep mobilizing this anti-immigrant sentiment. I think what we're seeing is that the American people don't want to see people being snatched up and kidnapped, right? And I think now sort of unintended consequence is that Americans are feeling a sort of moral outrage in the face of that cruelty. And that I don't think they're really calculating for.
So speaking of the suspension of kinds of rules of law, we also had the news this week, Danny, that Stephen Miller, on behalf of the White House, said that the White House is looking into suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Can you explain what that means and what its significance is?
Right. Habeas corpus is a writ. It's something we got from old England. And the idea was that it goes back to actually the king. And if the king wanted to throw you in jail, could Parliament do anything about it? Well, we borrowed this whole habeas thing. And what it does is essentially in the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights, the original text of the Constitution, the suspension clause essentially provides a protection, a limitation on the suspension of habeas, which is really just challenging someone's detention. Prisoners can do it, and detainees can use it as well under a federal statute. So what the suspension clause says basically is that thou shalt not suspend habeas corpus unless, and there's a narrow exception, in times of invasion, war, when public safety shall so require it. Now, the problem with this is that that exception is to be very narrowly applied, and it is probably the case that only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. Yes, we have historical examples of a president doing it, but that was during a time when Congress was not in session. It really wouldn't apply here. So the short answer is the idea that the president can unilaterally suspend habeas corpus is probably more an act of trolling than it is an actual plan.
Okay, let's say that they do it.
Yep.
What's to prevent American citizens from being detained without any ability to challenge it? If the government just decides, hey, we've decreed that you are an immigrant and therefore you don't have these rights and you don't even have an opportunity to prove you otherwise.
Yeah, this is a common flowchart I get into on shows, which is, well, this is something, if you suspend habeas corpus unconstitutionally, then the courts will say no. And then, of course, the next natural question is, what if Trump ignores the order? And you're right. In this flowchart, all flowcharts lead to what do you do when Trump says, I recognize that order is telling me to do something, and I hereby defy it. He hasn't quite done that yet. You see a lot of different word salad, which is like, well, we think the court order allows us to do this. We don't think we're defying it. We think we're complying with the law. But sooner or later, the road ends at an order that says, Trump administration, thou shalt do this. And they say, we hear you, we understand, and we're not doing it. So there is a backstop. The question is, when and if the Trump administration is told to do something by a court, will they defy it?
Let me ask you about the psychology of this for a moment, because so much of this is about fear, right? Exactly. Even if we don't get to this point that Danny's talking about, which is you have a court order that says you cannot suspend it. But when you have an administration official like Stephen Miller, a senior official, who comes out and says publicly, hey, we are looking into this, the chilling effect of what it means for the ordinary American who may not necessarily know what a habeas petition is or his rights are, but the fear that the administration is willing to strip people of their rights is the more cruel point.
The fear is based on the same story, which is that we are being invaded. Right. The logic of this administration is that the southern border is closed. So if the southern border is closed, then who are we being invaded by? It doesn't matter. The heart of Trumpism, what keeps Trumpism alive, is this imaginary enemy. This imaginary alien enemy. That is what sustains the fear and the division and the resentment. And that sort of alien enemy is exactly what, in their eyes, allows them to justify breaking the law. Now, breaking the law in the name of security and safety. And their best ally right now, which is Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, is doing it. Yeah. So Nayib Bukele right now, what he did a couple of years ago is that he declared an emergency. In that emergency, he essentially suspends constitutional rights. And within that, what he has done is created this incredibly massive mass incarceration. And through that, there are thousands of men sitting in that maximum prison without due process. That is what Donald Trump is looking at.
So, Danny, though, is this another situation in which this administration could find themselves in trouble because of the things they've been saying out in public? Because, as she just spelled out, they want Americans to believe the border is more secure than it's ever been. You know, crossings are down, which is actually true, but then also buy into the belief of an invasion. So if they have their own words on the record basically saying there is no more invasion. So how is that going to hold up in court?
Yeah, what we've seen in the last few weeks is a lot of public statements that I assure you are going to find their way into briefs and memos written by all the plaintiffs who are challenging their detention. So Trump often does this. He says things offhand. He tries to retreat to, well, that's, you know, I'm just riffing, and that's what some other people.
Yeah.
The lawyers told me. I'm not so sure I even know. He's very wily when it comes to those kinds of statements. But look, another thing about, we're talking about habeas, and I know for a lot of people, there's a clamoring for habeas. You can't suspend it. And, you know, one of the things I want to warn folks about is, as a criminal defense attorney, we all file lots of habeas petitions. They have probably a 5% success rate. So just be warned that even if, whether or not habeas is suspended, even if everybody has their habeas rights, the reality is habeas petitions are not often that successful in challenging detention. And by the way, just to give an example of Otsar, I can't pronounce it.
Rachel Maddow. Yep.
She was just released. She didn't even challenge her removal proceedings. She didn't even challenge the revocation of her visa. The victory, and I know that we had on the Chiron, you know, Trump's bad week, and look, I see this all the time, Trump getting the smackdown by courts. Don't be surprised if this individual ends up being removed. Yes, it was a victory. And yes, by the way, I read the Second Circuit's opinion, and it was highly critical of the Trump administration. But her victory may ultimately be a small one. It's essentially bail. Yeah. She's not even challenging the revocation of her visa, and this road may end with her removal. So folks need to be aware. Yes, there were some small victories this week, but this is an individual like many others where the end of the story is they're not in this country.